In Judge Elias Carter's courtroom, every case is predictable, and every judgment reflects his steadfast sense of justice. But when a timid 11-year-old girl steps forward and claims to be his daughter, his world is thrown into chaos. Armed with a letter from her late mother, a woman Elias once loved but lost, Grace Daniels shatters the careful life he's built and forces him to confront the ghosts of his past. As Elias and Grace navigate their fragile new bond, unsettling questions emerge about Evelyn's death and Grace's troubled journey through the foster care system. The closer they get to the truth, the more they uncover a dangerous conspiracy, one that cost Evelyn her life and now threatens Grace's future. Elias must decide if he's willing to risk everything: his career, his reputation, and his life, to protect the daughter he never knew. Will they uncover the truth before it's too late? Or will the secrets of the past destroy their chance at becoming a family? Through the Eyes of Grace is a heart-wrenching journey of redemption, love, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the face of adversity. Perfect for readers who believe in the power of second chances, this gripping novel will leave you breathless and rooting for a father and daughter to overcome all odds. Would you like to refine or expand on this further? The rhythmic sound of shuffling papers and hushed whispers filled the grand courtroom. Judge Elias Carter adjusted his glasses, his blue eyes scanning the docket before him. It was an ordinary day, or so he thought. Guardianship hearings were routine, rarely evoking much emotion beyond the standard legal considerations. Next case, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the darkwood paneling. Elias glanced at the docket. Daniels, Grace, guardianship hearing. He furrowed his brow at the note. 11-year-old in foster care, seeks special placement. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a small figure entered. Grace Daniels, clutching a worn stuffed bunny and a tattered backpack, shuffled timidly down the aisle. Her wide brown eyes darted nervously around the room, landing on Elias for a fleeting moment. Petitioner's representative, please step forward, Elias instructed, his voice calm but authoritative. The advocate, a composed woman in her 40s, guided Grace to her seat. Elias noticed Grace's trembling hands clutching her bunny tighter. Something about her struck him. Her vulnerability, perhaps, or the glint of quiet determination hidden behind her fear. Let's begin, Elias said, leaning forward slightly. The advocate introduced the case, explaining that Grace had been in foster care since her mother's death 2 years ago. But as she spoke, Elias noticed Grace fidgeting, her gaze fixed on her bunny. Do you have something to add, Miss Daniels? Elias asked gently. Grace hesitated, looking to her advocate for reassurance. The woman nodded. I have something to say, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom fell silent. Elias leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. Take your time, he said, his tone softer now. Grace took a deep breath. Your Honor, I think you're my dad. The words hung in the air, silencing even the faintest murmur in the room. Elias blinked, his composure momentarily shattered. I'm sorry, what did you say? He asked, his steady voice faltering for the first time in years. You're my dad, Grace repeated, her voice trembling but resolute. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded letter. My mom wrote this before she died. She said, you're my father. Elias stared at her, his chest tightening. The courtroom seemed to tilt on its axis as whispers rippled through the crowd. Recess, Elias announced abruptly, his gavel forgotten. Rising from his seat, he left the courtroom without another word, retreating to his chambers. Inside, he sat heavily at his desk, his hands trembling as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Evelyn Bennett. Her elegant, flowing script leapt off the page, pulling him back to a time he thought he had left behind. The letter began with an apology, followed by a confession. Evelyn admitted she had raised Grace alone, fearing the impact their existence might have on his burgeoning legal career. She had loved him, but she had also loved their daughter enough to bear the burden alone. Elias's breath hitched. The carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled as memories of Evelyn flooded in. Her infectious laugh, her sharp wit, and the brief but intense love they had shared. He read the letter again, Evelyn's final words echoing in his mind. "She deserves to know her father. Please take care of her, Elias." He pressed his palms against his face, trying to steady himself. How had he missed this? Why hadn't she told him? A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. The door opened, revealing Grace and her advocate. Grace hesitated in the doorway, clutching her bunny like a lifeline. Elias stood, towering over her, though his eyes were filled with vulnerability. "Please, come in," he said gently, motioning to the couch. Grace perched on the edge of the seat, her small hands gripping the bunny tightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I didn't mean to make you upset." Elias knelt down to her level, his usually commanding presence softened. "You didn't upset me," he said, his voice firm but kind. I wasn't expecting this." Grace looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Do you believe me?" Elias hesitated, the weight of the letter in his pocket. "I read your mother's letter," he said finally. "If she said I'm your father, then I believe her, and I believe you." A single tear slipped down Grace's cheek. I thought you might not want me." The words cut through Elias like a knife. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on hers. "I want you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to make up for the years we lost, but I want to try, if you'll let me." Grace's lips trembled before breaking into a small, tentative smile. "Okay," she whispered. That evening, Elias sat in his dimly lit study, the letter spread before him. He read it again and again, each word cementing his resolve. He had failed Evelyn, but he wouldn't fail Grace. The next morning, he made a call. "Laura Bennett, please," he said when the receptionist answered. "Laura speaking," came the voice on the other end, a sharp, professional tone softened by a hint of warmth. "It's Elias Carter. I need your help." Laura listened as Elias explained the situation, her silence heavy with thought. "This won't be easy," she said finally. "Biology isn't enough. You'll need to prove you can provide for her emotionally and physically." "I'll do whatever it takes," Elias replied firmly. "She's my daughter, Laura. I can't lose her." Laura's tone softened. "Then we'll make it happen. Let's start with building a case." As Elias ended the call, he glanced at the letter one last time. Evelyn's words seemed to echo in his mind. Take care of her, Elias. He would. For Grace, for Evelyn, and for the man he wanted to become. Elias arrived at the downtown office of Laura Bennett, one of the city's most respected family law attorneys. The modest building stood in contrast to its reputation for housing some of the fiercest legal minds in the region. Inside, Laura greeted Elias with a firm handshake and a keen, appraising look. "Judge Carter," she began, motioning for him to sit. "It's not every day I get a call from someone in your position about a case like this. This is personal," Elias admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Grace is my daughter. I only just found out, but I need to make things right." Laura leaned back, her expression softening. I've reviewed the initial details, and while biology is important, the court will also focus on her well-being. Her foster family has had her for over a year. They'll argue stability, emotional ties, things you'll need to counter. Elias nodded, taking a deep breath. What do I need to do? We'll start with the basics, demonstrating your ability to provide a stable, nurturing environment. That includes psychological evaluations, character references, and proof of your willingness to build a relationship with her. This won't be a quick process. I'll do whatever it takes, Elias said firmly. She's my daughter. Laura's eyes met his, a glimmer of approval in her gaze. Then let's get to work. The next day, Elias met with Miss Taylor, Grace's foster care advocate, in a small conference room at the foster care office. The walls were lined with outdated posters about family support services, the fluorescent lighting casting a harsh glow over the scene. Miss Taylor handed Elias a thick file. This is everything I have on Grace's case. She's been through a lot, 3 placements in 2 years. Her current foster family, the Walkers, have provided her with stability, but she still struggles with the trauma of losing her mother. Elias flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening. 3 placements? He repeated, his voice low. Why so many? It's common, Miss Taylor said, sighing. Not every home is a good fit. Grace has had to adapt quickly, which has left her guarded. She's resilient, but that kind of instability leaves scars. Elias closed the file, the weight of Grace's experiences pressing heavily on his chest. I need to fix this, he said, more to himself than to Miss Taylor. She's already started trusting you, Miss Taylor replied gently. That's a good sign. But she needs consistency and time. I won't let her down, Elias said. Not again. Elias arranged to spend an afternoon with Grace at a local park. The air was crisp, the trees shedding their fiery autumn leaves. Grace clutched her stuffed bunny as they walked along the path, her steps cautious but steady. I thought we could sit by the lake, Elias suggested. Maybe feed the ducks? Grace nodded, her eyes darting to him briefly before focusing on the path. They sat on a bench, and Elias handed her a small bag of breadcrumbs. For a while, they fed the ducks in silence, the occasional quack breaking the quiet. Do you come here often? Grace asked suddenly, her voice soft. I used to, Elias said. A long time ago. It's a good place to think. Grace tilted her head. What do you think about? Elias hesitated, then answered honestly. Lately? You. Trying to figure out how to be the dad you deserve. Grace looked at him, her eyes wide. You mean that? I do, Elias said, meeting her gaze. I know I have a lot to learn, but I want to try. If you'll let me. For the first time that day, Grace smiled, a small, tentative curve of her lips. Okay, she said. I'll let you. A week later, Laura called Elias to discuss a new development. They met in her office, where she handed him a document. The Walkers have formally expressed their intent to adopt Grace. Elias scanned the paper, his stomach sinking. Adopt? But I'm her father. That's true, Laura said, but they've had her for over a year. The court will consider their bond with her, especially since they've provided stability during a difficult time. Elias set the paper down, his hands clenching into fists. They're good people, but she belongs with me. Laura nodded. I believe you, but the court will need more than that. We need to demonstrate not just your ability to provide for her, but why this is in her best interest. How do we do that? Elias asked. By focusing on your efforts to build a relationship with her, Laura said. Keep spending time with her. Let her see that you're not just someone fighting for custody. You're someone fighting for her. Elias's resolve hardened. Whatever it takes. The first court conference brought the tension to a head. Elias and the Walkers sat on opposite sides of the small conference room, Grace's foster advocate seated between them. Grace wasn't present, but her absence was palpable. Maria Walker, Grace's foster mother, spoke first. "We love Grace like our own. She's been part of our family for over a year, and we've worked hard to give her a sense of security." Elias listened, his heart heavy. He couldn't deny their sincerity, but he also couldn't back down. When it was his turn to speak, Elias cleared his throat. "I didn't know about Grace until recently. If I had, I would have been there for her from the beginning. I want to be part of her life, not just as her biological father, but as someone she can depend on." The judge overseeing the conference nodded, her expression neutral. "This case will require a full hearing to determine what's in Grace's best interest." After the conference, Laura pulled Elias aside. "They have a strong case, Elias. The Walkers are clearly good people." "I know," Elias said quietly. "But she's my daughter." "Then we'll make sure the court sees why that matters," Laura said firmly. "But you need to be prepared for this to get harder before it gets better." Elias nodded, the weight of the battle ahead settling on his shoulders. He glanced at a photo of Grace he'd kept in his pocket, a reminder of what he was fighting for. "I'll be ready," he said. Elias sat at his desk, Evelyn's letter spread out before him. The words were etched into his memory, yet something about them gnawed at him. Why had she kept Grace a secret for so long? And why did her illness seem to come so suddenly, with no warning? He tapped his pen against the desk, frustration bubbling to the surface. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Laura stepped into the office, holding a slim folder. "I did some digging," she began, setting the file down. "Evelyn's death certificate lists cancer as the cause, but there's no record of prior treatment. No doctor's visits, no diagnosis." Elias frowned. "How is that possible?" "It's not uncommon for people without resources to forego treatment," Laura admitted, but Evelyn was meticulous. "Something feels off." Elias flipped through the documents, his gut twisting. "There's more to this," he muttered. "I can feel it." The smell of leather and pipe tobacco greeted Elias as he stepped into Gerald Carter's study. His former mentor sat in a high-backed chair, a book resting on his lap. "Elias," Gerald said warmly, motioning for him to sit. "What brings you here?" Elias explained everything. The letter, Evelyn's death, and the unsettling inconsistencies he'd found. Gerald listened intently, his face growing somber. "It sounds like Evelyn was trying to protect Grace from something, or someone," Gerald said finally. "The question is, who?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But if she was onto something, it could explain why she kept me in the dark." Gerald nodded thoughtfully. "Follow the trail. If Evelyn left clues, they'll lead you to the answers. And Elias, be careful. If someone wanted this buried, they won't take kindly to you digging it up." That evening, Elias and Grace sat in the living room, the warmth of a crackling fire filling the space. Grace was sketching quietly, her bunny perched beside her. Elias watched her, the weight of his earlier discoveries heavy on his mind. "Grace," he said gently, breaking the silence, "did your mom leave you anything? Something special?" Grace paused, then nodded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a delicate silver locket. "She gave me this before she got sick," she said softly. "She told me to keep it safe." Elias leaned forward, his heart racing. "May I see it?" Grace hesitated, then handed it over. Elias examined the locket, noticing a tiny hinge on one side. Carefully, he pried it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. "It's a name," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Leonard Hayes. Do you think he knew my mom?" Grace asked, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "I think he might have," Elias replied, "and I think he might know what happened to her." Elias stood outside the modest clinic, the name Dr. Leonard Hayes etched onto the frosted glass door. He had called ahead and confirmed an appointment, but the unease in his chest hadn't lessened. Inside, the doctor greeted him with a practiced smile. "Judge Carter," Dr. Hayes said, shaking his hand, "what can I do for you?" Elias wasted no time. "I'm here about Evelyn Bennett." The smile faltered. "Evelyn," Hayes began, his voice trailing off. "She was a remarkable woman. You treated her," Elias pressed. "What aren't you telling me?" Dr. Hayes sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Evelyn came to me months before her death. She suspected foul play regarding some children in the foster care system. She was gathering evidence, but then she got sick, too sick to continue. Was it cancer?" Elias asked. Hayes hesitated. "That's what the test said, but Evelyn didn't think so. She believed someone was trying to silence her." Elias's blood ran cold. "Do you have any of her records?" Hayes shook his head. "No. She told me she had hidden everything somewhere safe. If she didn't tell you where, I can't help." Back at home, Elias sat beside Grace as she worked on her latest drawing. He hadn't told her everything he'd learned. He wasn't sure how to explain it. But as he watched her, he realized the truth was unavoidable. "Grace," he began, his voice soft, "your mom was trying to protect you." Grace looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "From what?" Elias hesitated. "From people who wanted to hurt her. She was trying to do the right thing, but it put her in danger." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "She always said she was doing something important. I didn't know it was dangerous." Elias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She loved you more than anything. That's why she fought so hard. And now it's my turn to fight. For her and for you." Grace wiped her eyes, a small smile breaking through her sadness. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly. Elias pulled her into a gentle hug. "So am I, Grace. So am I." Elias sat in his study, surrounded by papers and documents retrieved from Evelyn's locket. His discovery of a name, Dr. Leonard Hayes, had led him to unsettling revelations about Evelyn's final days. Alongside Hayes's testimony, the papers pointed to systemic corruption in the foster care system, financial incentives driving children into unfit homes. Laura arrived shortly after, her expression grim as she glanced over the evidence. "If this is accurate," she said, holding up a sheet, "it's more than just a broken system. It's criminal." Elias nodded. Evelyn wasn't just fighting for Grace. She was trying to stop this. "This isn't just about custody anymore," Laura replied. "You're going up against powerful people. Are you ready for that?" Elias's jaw tightened. "For Grace?" "Absolutely." The next day, Elias visited the Walkers, Grace's foster family. The cozy suburban house stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. Maria Walker answered the door, her expression wary. "Judge Carter, this is unexpected. I need to talk to you and Richard," Elias said, stepping inside. The Walkers led him to the living room. Elias didn't waste time. "I've uncovered evidence linking Grace's placement to a larger scheme. It's possible you've been manipulated." Maria's face paled. "What are you saying?" "I'm not accusing you. Elias clarified. But someone in the system has been exploiting children for financial gain. Evelyn tried to stop it, and now Grace is caught in the crossfire. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped. We had no idea. All we wanted was to give Grace a safe home. Elias softened. I believe you, but this fight is bigger than us. If you care about Grace, help me protect her. Maria exchanged a glance with her husband before nodding. What do you need from us? That evening, Elias sat with Grace in the living room, the fire casting a warm glow. She clutched her stuffed bunny, her expression hesitant. Grace, Elias began gently, I need to ask you something important. Did anything strange happen in your foster homes before the Walkers? Grace's brow furrowed, and she hugged the bunny tighter. Sometimes they wouldn't talk to me. They just wanted the money. Elias's heart clenched. What do you mean? One family, Grace said softly, kept saying they didn't want a kid. They just wanted the checks. Mom always said I deserved better. Elias reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. You do deserve better, and I'm going to make sure no one uses you, or any other child, like that again. The following morning, Elias arrived at his office to find a manila envelope on his desk. Inside were photographs of him and Grace, taken without their knowledge. A single note accompanied them. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Elias's blood ran cold. He immediately called Laura, who arrived within the hour. She examined the photos, her expression darkening. This is a threat, she said. Whoever's behind this knows you're getting close. I'm not backing down, Elias said firmly. Grace's life and Evelyn's legacy depend on this? Then we need to escalate, Laura replied. I'll file for an injunction to protect you and Grace. But be careful, Elias. They're watching. Elias gathered his allies that evening in Gerald Carter's study. Gerald sat at the head of the table, his presence steadying. We have evidence, Elias said, laying out the documents. But we need more. This has to hold up in court. Gerald nodded. Start with the names you have. Track their connections to the placements. Laura chimed in. We'll also need testimony. Dr. Hayes, the Walkers, anyone who can corroborate the systemic failures. Elias glanced at Grace, who was quietly drawing in the corner. This isn't just about custody anymore, he said. It's about justice for her and for every child who's been hurt. Gerald placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. You've taken on bigger battles before. You can do this. Elias nodded, determination burning in his chest. Then let's get to work. The courtroom was packed, a palpable tension filling the air as the Walker's attorney, Ms. Fulton, took the floor. Richard and Maria Walker sat confidently at the witness stand, their hands clasped tightly together. Your Honor, Ms. Fulton began, her voice firm yet compassionate. The Walkers have provided Grace Daniels with stability and love during one of the most difficult periods of her life. They've nurtured her, ensured her education, and offered her a safe, supportive environment. Maria spoke softly, her voice trembling slightly. Grace has been like one of our own children. We've watched her grow, seen her smile return after so much heartache. We just want what's best for her. Elias sat silently at the opposing table, his hands clenched under the desk. He couldn't deny the Walkers' sincerity. They clearly cared about Grace. But the thought of losing his daughter tore at his heart. When Miss Fulton finished, Elias glanced at Laura, who gave him a reassuring nod. They've made their case, she whispered. Now it's our turn. Laura stood, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor as she approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, we'd like to call Judge Elias Carter to the stand. Elias rose, his tall frame commanding attention as he made his way to the witness chair. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself. He had faced countless legal battles, but none had ever felt this personal. Laura began. "Judge Carter, when did you first learn about Grace Daniels?" "Just a few months ago," Elias replied, his voice steady. "Her mother, Evelyn Bennett, left me a letter before she passed, explaining everything." "And what did you feel when you read that letter?" Laura asked, her tone softening. Elias hesitated, glancing at the bench where Grace sat clutching her stuffed bunny. "Shock, guilt, love. I realized I had missed so much of her life, and I knew I couldn't let her down again." "Why do you believe Grace should live with you?" Laura pressed. "Because she deserves to know her father," Elias said, his voice firm. "She deserves a stable, loving home, not just from people who care for her, but from her family. I want to give her that." The judge leaned forward, her gaze softening. "Ms. Daniels, would you like to share anything with the court?" Grace hesitated, her eyes darting between the Walkers and Elias. Laura knelt beside her, whispering words of encouragement. Slowly, Grace stood, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing courtroom. "I'm really grateful for the Walkers," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "They've been really kind to me. But," she paused, clutching her bunny tighter, "I've always wanted to know my dad." The room fell silent as she turned to Elias, her wide brown eyes locking onto his. "He listens to me. He tries really hard to make me feel like I belong. And I think I do." Elias felt tears sting his eyes as Grace sat down, her words echoing in the stillness. Before the judge could adjourn for deliberation, Laura stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence to present." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as she handed the judge a folder. "This contains proof of systemic corruption in the foster care system, a corruption Evelyn Bennett tried to expose before her untimely death. It directly impacts Grace's case." The judge flipped through the documents, her expression darkening. "Ms. Bennett's findings appear credible," she said. "I'll need time to review this." Elias sat back, his heart pounding. He knew the evidence was damning, but it also shifted the focus of the case, introducing a new layer of complexity. 2 days later, the courtroom reconvened, the tension almost unbearable. The judge entered, her face calm but serious. After careful deliberation, she began. "It's clear that both parties care deeply for Grace Daniels. The Walkers have provided stability, and their contributions cannot be overlooked. However," Elias held his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Given the biological connection, Mr. Carter's efforts to build a relationship with his daughter, and the concerning implications of the evidence presented, I find that custody should be awarded to Judge Elias Carter." Relief and emotion washed over Elias as he turned to Grace, who broke into a smile and ran to him. He knelt, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Elias replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Grace stood in the doorway of her new room, her wide brown eyes scanning the space. The room was a bright contrast to the rest of Elias's austere home, filled with colorful books, a cozy bedspread, and a shelf for her sketches. "Do you like it?" Elias asked from behind her, his voice laced with uncertainty. Grace stepped inside, running her fingers over the books. "It's nice," she said softly. Then, clutching her stuffed bunny, she turned to him. "Is this really mine?" "It's all yours," Elias said, a small smile forming. "If there's anything you want to add or change, we'll do it together." Grace nodded, her lips curling into a tentative smile. "Thank you." For the first time, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. They were finally starting to feel like a family. The next morning, Elias drove Grace to the cemetery, a bouquet of bright yellow daisies in her lap. The air was cool, and the leaves rustled softly as they approached Evelyn's grave. Grace knelt, placing the flowers gently on the headstone. She traced the engraved letters with her fingers, her expression a mix of sadness and peace. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "I wanted you to know. I found him. I found Dad." Elias stood quietly, giving her space. After a moment, Grace looked up at him. "Do you think she's happy?" "I think she's proud of you," Elias said, kneeling beside her, "of how brave you've been. And I think she'd be happy to see us here together." Grace nodded, wiping away a tear. "I miss her so much." "I know," Elias said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And that's okay. She'll always be with you." As they stood to leave, Grace slipped her hand into his. Elias squeezed it gently, silently vowing to honor Evelyn's memory by being the father Grace deserved. Adjusting to their new life wasn't without its difficulties. Grace struggled with trust at school, hesitant to make friends. Elias, unaccustomed to parenting, found himself navigating the complexities of bedtime negotiations, forgotten homework, and occasional emotional outbursts. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Grace blurted, "What if I'm not good at this?" Elias paused, setting down the dish he was drying. "Good at what?" "Being your daughter," she said, her voice small. "What if I mess it up?" Elias crouched down, meeting her eye level. "Grace, there's no right way to be a daughter. We're both figuring this out. And I promise you, there's nothing you could do to make me stop loving you." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she smiled. "Okay." From that moment, their bond grew stronger. Each challenge became an opportunity for them to learn and grow together. On a sunny weekend, Elias surprised Grace with tickets to an art fair. Her eyes lit up as they wandered through the vibrant stalls, filled with paintings, sculptures, and handcrafted jewelry. At one booth, a local artist offered free drawing lessons for children. Grace hesitated, but Elias encouraged her. "Go on. I'll be right here." Grace picked up a pencil, her initial strokes tentative. But as she immersed herself in the activity, her natural talent shone through. By the end of the session, the artist handed her the drawing with a smile. "You've got real talent. Keep at it." Grace beamed, showing Elias the drawing. "What do you think?" "I think it's incredible," he said, his pride evident. "Just like you." That evening, Grace sat at her desk, sketching with a newfound passion. For the first time, Elias saw her fully at ease, her confidence blossoming. As the weeks turned into months, their life settled into a comforting rhythm. Grace excelled at school, made new friends, and filled her room with drawings and keepsakes. Elias, once consumed by his career, found joy in the small moments, helping with homework, cheering at school events, and listening to Grace's stories about her day. One quiet evening, they sat together on the couch, looking through Grace's latest sketches. She handed him one, a drawing of the two of them holding hands under a bright sun. Above them, she had written the word family. Elias stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "This is beautiful," he said. "I'm going to frame it. You really like it?" Grace asked shyly. "I love it," Elias replied, pulling her into a hug. "Just like I love you." As they sat there, sharing stories and laughter, Elias felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. Together, they had found a home, a family, and a future filled with hope.